Great, and we'll begin. So first, for our context, we just want to give a bit of an orientation to who we are and why we're here. To begin, I want to offer a little bit about the Creation Care Alliance. As I shared, I am the director of the Creation Care Alliance, and we are a network of congregations and people of faith here in the Southern Blue Ridge, striving to love our human and non-human neighbors well as a part of our faith and as a moral imperative. And so I'm grateful to be able to be here, and for all of our network who is here, all of the faith leaders and pastors and lay leaders who are here, because this issue of climate action and the carbon plan matters to them from that perspective. Your voices matter, and I'm grateful that you're here. And I'm going to pass it to Gray and Susannah to provide a brief orientation to their aspects as well.
Hi, everybody. My name is Gray Jernigan. I'm the Central Regional Director with MountainTrue. We're an environmental advocacy organization that champions clean waters, resilient forests, and healthy communities across the Southern Blue Ridge Mountains.
And Susannah?
Hi, everybody. Susannah Tuttle, she, her pronouns. I am the director of North Carolina Interfaith Power and Light, which is a primary campaign of the North Carolina Council of Churches Eco Justice Connection Initiative. So I'm really grateful to be here. Sarah and I have been working together for many years, and it feels great to be back on the team, and glad to be here with Gray too. Thank you so much for joining. I look forward to working with y'all today.
Thanks, Susannah. I'll also add that Susannah is also a part of a People Power NC coalition that's been working on these issues. So she's bringing both her role as NC Interfaith Power and Light and also her role in that coalition. And yes, Susannah, it's great to be back in a Zoom room with you. Wonderful to have you here. So thanks for being here. Just a little bit more context before we dive in. We also just want to name why we're here. We are here, yes, to educate on the carbon plan and the upcoming Utilities Commission hearing. We want you to have a clear framework for why we're talking about this, how we got here, how we got to this place of talking about a carbon plan, and also why it's so important that we do take action on this plan. We also want to underscore the importance of this moment particularly. So we're not going to dive in any more deeply in this presentation into this issue other than just this one moment. But we do want to name that the carbon plan in North Carolina is more important now than it was months ago, than it's ever been, because of the most recent Supreme Court hearing, so West Virginia versus the EPA. That hearing, which happened on June 30th, gutted the EPA and the ability of the EPA to regulate carbon emissions from a federal standpoint. So what that means is that statewide programs, statewide like regulation, that is ultimately what we have now. And we want our state regulation to be as strong as possible. So this carbon plan really, really, really matters, particularly given the context of this moment. And we do want to name that. We also obviously are here to help you take action. We want you to understand how to raise your voice and how to make a difference in light of this plan, what it means to testify, and what it means to witness in other ways as to the need for this plan. So that's some of what we'll cover today. And I'm going to pass the call now to Gray to provide some additional kind of context for how we got here.
Thank you, Sarah. So I wanted to give some background on the carbon plan, the energy bill passed the last legislative session in the North Carolina General Assembly, and how we got to where we are now. So last session, 2021, a bipartisan General Assembly drafted this landmark legislation, House Bill 951, that Governor Cooper signed into law last October. And it requires Duke Energy to reduce carbon emissions by 70% by 2030 based on the 2025 levels, and then achieve carbon neutrality by 2050. So this is a major step toward addressing climate change on the state level. Again, there's the problematic issue that Sarah highlighted in light of EPA, West Virginia v. EPA, where now we can't rely on the federal government to regulate the power industry and CO2 emissions from the power industry nationwide. And unfortunately, we're in a situation where a patchwork of states have to take an effort, and North Carolina is on the forefront of addressing that. We're in an elite group of states that are tackling carbon emissions from power generation head on. So that's the good news. That's major progress here. To achieve these goals and ambitious goals, I must add, the utility, Duke Energy, must submit a carbon plan every 2 years, where the North Carolina Utilities Commission, however, is ultimately responsible for structure and contents of the plan, the requirements be imposed on Duke and what Duke has to comply with. And the judgment on this next bullet point is kind of questionable. Instead of taking the lead on putting a plan out there, the Utilities Commission ordered Duke Energy to submit a draft plan, to basically come up with a plan that they can execute, and to turn that back into the Utilities Commission by May 16th. And they did that. But it gives Duke the first opportunity to stake out that negotiating position of this is what we're offering. And now it's up to the Utilities Commission to refine it to something that's acceptable to the ratepayers across North Carolina, that's acceptable to all citizens, because we all have to live with carbon emissions and the effects of climate change across the state. So currently, the Utilities Commission is hosting public hearings on the draft plan. They hosted a hearing Monday night in Durham, Tuesday night in Wilmington, and we've got a hearing on July 27th coming up in Asheville, which is the Western North Carolina in-person hearing, kind of most relevant to our geographic area of work. There's also a virtual option for a hearing on August 23rd for those that can't attend a hearing in person. And then the approval of the state's carbon plan comes by December of 2022. Next slide, please. So I want to go kind of through Duke's proposal. This is the draft plan that Duke put forward, and it's interesting because they put forward 4 different portfolios in order to achieve carbon neutrality in 2050. 3 of those missed the interim deadline of 70% reduction by 2030. And I'll say up front, none of these are acceptable to us right off the bat, or to any advocates across the state in this space. But I don't want to just paint doom and gloom all over this. There is some good news, and it's a starting point for conversation. So across the board, the proposals by Duke make significant advances in the development of solar and wind energy resources and battery storage. So the downside of what Duke is proposing, Duke is basically asking the Utilities Commission to approve all 4 of these portfolios and kind of give them a blank check, just blanket approval to do implement whatever steps they want to achieve the goals, and kind of wide latitude. And we think that's unacceptable. We think that there should be a definite plan and steps to achieve that. Some other highlights of the plans, each one includes between 4,900 and 6,200 megawatts of coal plant retirements. That's good. And they include efforts to reduce energy use through energy efficiency and demand side management programs. That's good, but there are some concerns with what they are proposing in that area. Here's the bad news. Across all 4 of these portfolios, each portfolio includes 2,400 megawatts of new natural gas energy production and around 1,000 megawatts of gas-fired peaking capacity. So that's new fossil fuels going into the system. highly concerning when we're trying to reach carbon neutrality to introduce more carbon emissions on the front end. I want to go through kind of the specifics of at least two of these that we at MountainTrue have looked at in terms of how do they stack up in terms of a starting point for something that the Utilities Commission could revise down into a acceptable plan. Portfolio number one from the carbon reduction perspective is the best. It's also the most expensive. But it achieves the 2030 70% reduction deadline. And it does that by investing in one 800 megawatt block of offshore wind, 5,400 megawatts of new solar, and the addition of 1,800 megawatts of new battery energy storage capacity. Portfolio two is does not meet the interim deadline. That is the major drawback with portfolio two is it pushes that 70% reduction back to 2032. But looking at it on the whole, and the statute contemplates some flexibility on that interim deadline when, especially when renewable sources are considered. It's not terrible. It achieves that 70% reduction by 2032 by investing in two 800 megawatt blocks of offshore wind in 2029 and 2031, and 5,800 megawatts of solar. But it has less battery storage in that portfolio. Portfolios 3 and 4, I'm not even going to get into the details of. They're, in my mind, off the table because they rely on new nuclear facilities and unproven technologies, talking about small modular nuclear reactors that are unproven on a commercial market and would be unacceptable. And so with that, kind of digging into the details of those starting points, we can move on to the next slide about what we're our criticisms of this and what the Utilities Commission should be focusing on. These headlines are kind of built out with a little bit more detail on our website. I can actually drop that into the chat right now. Pardon me. All right, so there's a blog post that I just dropped into the chat that expands on each of these points, but we've developed 10 points or criticisms of the plan that we're calling on the Utilities Commission to address through their process in developing the final carbon decarbonization plan. First of all, there should be no new gas contemplated in these plans. All four of those scenarios require large quantities of gas-fired generation, and we should avoid any construction of new gas facilities. Number two, this is where we're somewhat comfortable with missing that 2030 deadline in portfolio two because of the doubling of investments in offshore wind, two 800 megawatt blocks of offshore wind in that, but we're not willing to concede any of that interim deadline for nuclear technology. That's off the table. Number three, no reliance on commercially unproven technology. Expanding out of that the portfolios 3 and 4 rely on those small modular nuclear reactors that have not been unproven, that have not been proven commercially, or gas plants that could theoretically be converted to hydrogen. Again, an unproven technology, and we can't rely on unproven technologies to meet such a short deadline. Number four, this is energy efficiency and demand side management that I highlighted earlier. The plans do contemplate energy efficiency and demand side management programs, but they include them at levels that have already been rejected by stakeholders in a collaborative setting. So we want to see increased levels of energy efficiency and demand side management, basically reducing the demand so that we don't need that new gas that's being proposed in some of these plans. We don't want to rely on the utilities inflated cost assumptions, we think some of the assumptions in the plan proposed by Duke are inflated, and especially when related to new generation and transmission. And we would challenge those cost assumptions. We also think the plan needs to do better at protecting historically marginalized communities. That includes prioritizing the retirement of fossil fuel plants near communities that have been disproportionately burdened. Those are primarily low-income communities and communities of color across the state. And when it comes to any new pipelines, fossil fuel plants, their siting should be considered. We don't think that those new plants should come online, and especially in communities that are already burdened, that they shouldn't have to be burdened any further. Transmission is another area of concern. Transmission is really the bottleneck limiting our access to renewables. And so we would ask the carbon plan to order Duke to build out sufficient transmission capacity to access the full potential of onshore and offshore wind and solar power in a timely manner to meet these deadlines. The next point is on securitization. And securitization, I'm not going to get into the details, but there's a great resource at the Rocky Mountain Institute explaining securitization as a financing tool that helps retire coal-fired power plants while reducing costs for consumers. And so it's a win-win for the company and consumers, ratepayers, and the sooner coal plants are retired, the more customers can benefit from the savings of securitization. The ninth point we have here is that the carbon plan should increase the resiliency of the energy system. Energy systems are vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. We've seen this when the grid in Texas went down very recently. And so the plan needs to address resilience in the face of climate threats. Additionally, this is our last point, that alternative plans might be submitted through this process. I think Susannah is going to touch on the intervener process, and there's going to be opportunities for organizations to put in alternative plans that reach these same goals in different ways than Duke has proposed. And the Utilities Commission should give those full consideration as well and decide which elements of those plans might bolster the state's ultimate decarbonization plan. Some additional things, some additional opportunities for justice in these plans I'd like to highlight. These aren't proposed by Duke, but it's completely up to the Utilities Commission to take on these considerations. The first is affordability. I mean, this is going to be an expensive process. We see the cost proposals and the proposed impact on rates that Duke is projecting. And that shouldn't be borne by ratepayers, especially the most vulnerable ones that have had to put up with pollution and with the impacts of living near these facilities. So affordability on bills is definitely something that should be considered. The rates are going to be set through a separate process later on down the road, but it doesn't mean that the carbon plan can't address affordability in it. We also want to address climate adaptation and the effect of the climate crisis on the grid. That speaks to resiliency again. We also want to address the internalizing the costs and the impact of fossil fuels on community. Again, the communities that have borne the brunt of this are the most vulnerable, the lowest income, communities of color that have been disadvantaged across the board systematically. And the carbon plan should focus on addressing those costs that fossil fuels have borne on those communities for decades, generations. And then accounting for methane and other greenhouse gases other than CO2. We know methane has a much higher impact on warming in the atmosphere compared to CO2, even though it has a shorter lifespan in the atmosphere. And so accounting for other greenhouse gases beyond CO2 would be important in this plan, especially with the transition from coal to natural gas. And so at this point, I think I'll pass it to Susannah to speak more about the public input process.
Thanks, Gray. And, it's always so important to go through all of the different pieces that you just brought up of the details of the plan. So I really appreciate that recap. So the North Carolina Carbon Plan, the role of public comment, hopefully that's why many of you have joined today, because you are potentially considering providing your perspective on this process and what we want to see for a carbon plan that meets the public interest. This is a carbon plan that really needs to be developed by the people for the people, right? And so we're grateful that the NCUC has elevated the role of public comment in this docket by scheduling both in-person and virtual public hearings in the carbon plan. And we'll go into a little detail about that in a little bit. I just want to, elevate that the law states clearly that the carbon reduction goals and the plan that dictates how Duke Energy will achieve them are the responsibility of the North Carolina Utility Commission. So this is very different than an IRP hearing or a rate case hearing that some of you might be familiar with and maybe have participated in that process before. Duke Energy is a part of this process, of course, and will need to implement what the carbon plan is on the grid. But the role of the Utility Commission is that this is really in their wheelhouse. So it's important to ensure that the carbon plan represents the interests of North Carolina citizens, not Duke Energy investors. Every North Carolina city, business, and household will be impacted by the design of this carbon plan. If there's any messages and education that you can be giving your neighbors and your friends and family, is that this is going to impact every single one of us in the state. This is very, very important opportunity and time for North Carolina. This is the first process of its kind in the entire South. And so the role that we're setting in the region of our country to implement this plan is a way for North Carolina to continue to be a leader in the way that we're addressing the impacts and issues of climate change. We all deserve to make our voices heard and share our valuable input. So be thinking about ways in which you might tell your story about why you care. Certainly the fact that you took the time to be a part of this webinar is part of what you can be sharing, that you're learning, that you really want to understand how this carbon plan is going to impact you, your family, and all of that we love, the people and planet that we wish to protect. So the process should be transparent and accessible for all, with an explicit focus on environmental justice, as Gray alluded to. So next slide, I'm going to share about what is next. So we have the in-person and virtual hearings. We've had a great success in Durham. I was able to actually be a part of the rally that took place outside in front of the courthouse on Monday in Durham. We had hundreds of people gather. It was really inspiring with great speakers. And then for the folks that went into the building, I heard it went really, really well. And it's exciting to hear from the public about why we care so much. I think the commissioners are really going to be impacted by the level of public engagement in this process. Also, as it says here, organizations and individuals are in the final days of the deadline to formally file to intervene, which is a legal action where interested stakeholders can take to directly participate in regulatory proceedings. So that deadline is this Friday. And it's an exciting process. And it's really important because the commission is required to address any formal comments submitted by an intervening party to the docket. So when you're providing public comment at a public hearing, the commissioners are actually given a chance to ask you any questions or to have you repeat anything that you might have shared. In most cases, they don't. So in Durham, we did not have anyone of the commissioners ask. From what I heard from inside the building, people just were allowed to give their public testimony, and then that does go into the docket as a public comment. When an intervening agency or individual files as an intervener, the commissioners actually do have to formally respond. So that's a little bit different. And I'm just going to drop into the chat right now. Today, I'm very excited to announce that North Carolina Interfaith Power and Light filed to intervene, and this is the press release that went out this morning. So hopefully that'll give a perspective of what we're highlighting in the opportunities for the carbon plan to actually reduce energy burden across the state from an energy justice perspective. So I think I'm passing it back to Sarah.
Yep. Thanks, Susannah. And I'm so grateful that you all are intervening. I know that's going to be really important. Yeah, so I just want to talk a bit about the hearings themselves and what they'll be like, and offer some tips for testimony. So our hope certainly is that most of you are here because you want to be a part of this process and you want to speak to the importance of a more just and sustainable carbon plan that can truly create a clean energy landscape and a more just landscape in North Carolina. In order to participate, you need to know a little bit about what this is going to be like. So that's what we want to talk about now. These in-person meetings will be held in courthouses in each city, and the meetings are very judicial and formal in nature. So if you've ever participated in a meeting like this, it can be a bit intimidating, and that is something that we want you to know ahead of time so that you're not caught off guard. This is a really formal process, but we'll talk more in a minute about how you belong there, we belong there, and the formality of it doesn't mean that it's not something that we should be doing. Also, members of the public in attendance can sign up to speak. Again, that's what we've been talking about, the public witness here, the testimony itself. You need to be there early to do that. We'll also talk about that. And you'll be speaking to the commissioners about the plan itself and your own feelings about it. To do so, again, about the formality of this process, you're going to be sworn in. So again, a really formal process, really formal procedure. You'll be sworn in order to speak. And you'll also have a time limit of 2 to 3 minutes. So it's just a short amount of time. Preparing your comments ahead of time is really important. And it is unlikely, but it is possible that Duke Energy could decide to ask you questions about your testimony. This is probably not going to happen if you tell your personal story and talk about why this plan is important to you, which is what we're encouraging you to do. This would happen more if you got up and decided to argue statistics or to argue facts. That's something that the interveners are going to be doing, but really not the place for public comment. So let me talk more about that. Tips on testimony. So the testimony is my favorite part. So this is where I start to get excited. Again, we want to remind you that you belong in this space. If you live in North Carolina, you have the right to be in this courtroom. You have the right to share your position and to share your voice. This matters to our lives. It matters to the lives of our families and our children, to our communities and to our neighbors. And so we have every right to be in this space. If you are a Duke Energy ratepayer, it's also very important that you identify yourself as such, because that will be something that is taken into account when you offer your feelings about the Duke Energy carbon plans that have been presented. Another tip on testimony, we want to encourage you not to identify yourself with an organization during testimony. So if you belong to the Creation Care Alliance, and the organization that I serve as director of, and you got up and said, hey, I belong to the Creation Care Alliance, and that's why I'm here. I, as the person who am giving organizational testimony, would actually not be allowed to speak because they would have already heard from the Creation Care Alliance. And that's also true for Sierra Club and other groups that we might belong to. So there is probably one person who has been selected for all of these organizations to be the organizational testifier. And if you are not that person, please don't name your organizational membership. Instead, stand up and tell your personal story and talk about why this carbon plan matters to you. So again, don't worry about the technical facts. We have interveners, energy experts who are doing that. What you can do and what you can do that will matter deeply is to put a face on this plan, to tell your story and help people understand how this impacts real people right now. Link the carbon plan to your daily life. That's something that you can do. So if you have a desire for energy independence, if you are concerned about the climate crisis, if you need your bill to be more affordable, or you have neighbors that you know are struggling with their bills, those are all things that you can name to help the Utilities Commission begin to understand that this is a truly personal and real life issue. The carbon plan has a real life impact. We also encourage you to link this to your moral imperatives, link the carbon plan to your moral imperatives. That means that if you're primarily here, I mean, I've seen some folks in the chat already who are saying, you know, I believe that people have the right to affordable energy that's just and that's not harming our planet and our future. That's a moral statement, and you should share that people have a right to affordable, clean, equitable energy, that we have a right to this future that we deserve. That's something that you can name that will have an impact. Also, I would say, as someone who works with faith communities, you can talk about the fact that you're a person of faith. You can speak from your perspective as a person of faith or of spirituality, calling for a more just reality. That's another piece that you can include in your testimony. Also, any time that you can use stories to build your narrative, that's going to stand out. These hearings can take a long time. We might be there for a while. And so stories are going to bring our audience of the Utilities Commission back to us a little bit and remind them again of the importance of this for real people living here in North Carolina. Some examples of stories might be if you've been impacted by climate change, if you've been an impact of increased flooding. We know that we had a terrible flood just about a year ago in Canton and Crusoe, North Carolina, just not far at all from where I grew up, where people died. And we know that climate change was one of the reasons that happened. So if you can share a personal story of being impacted by climate change, or if you can share a story of being impacted by air pollution, if you have asthma, all of those things are going to make a difference as well. We encourage you to tell a story and to link that into your testimony. We also encourage you to lend support to the NCUC for thinking outside of the box. So the NCUC is probably not going to feel super comfortable thinking outside of the box, but we want them to do that. And so if you can support them, if you can say to them, look, the carbon plan can be better, and we want to support you as ratepayers, you know, as North Carolinians, in considering innovative policy and pilot programs and creative ways to help us meet our goals. That's a really important thing that you can say as well. And I've seen in the chat a lot of really creative things being proposed. So naming your support for creative solutions is also something that's important and vital. And lastly, just another tip. We want to encourage you to write your comments out and prepare to speak. When we get nervous, we tend to talk very fast. Reading your comments, writing your comments, and then reading them and preparing to give your testimony will help you do that in a way that can make the most impact, where people can hear you and can truly understand the points that you're emphasizing because you've practiced. Also, writing and reading your comments will help you make sure that you do not go over time, because you will not be given additional time to speak. And so we want to make sure that in your 2 to 3 minutes, you are able to say everything that you need to say about this carbon plan to help this truly, this opportunity for the feedback of the people to be as successful as possible. I'm going to pass it to Susannah now.
Great, thanks, Sarah. So hearing details, as I mentioned earlier, Durham and Wilmington happened yesterday and the day before, so it's been a busy week already. If you're interested in receiving notes, People Power NC, the collaborative of lots of organizations, has been compiling experiences. So feel free to reach out about that, and I can direct you to the folks that attended and spoke at those. And I'm going to drop into the chat if Sarah hasn't already. Here's information about how you can sign up, because Vote Solar has on their website the ability to track who's going. That's really helpful, and it'll also then help give you the resources that are being provided to participate. So dropped that in there. And then, of course, the virtual hearings are important to learn about. So I'm going to put into the chat also the details about the virtual hearings for folks that are not able to attend in person, but would like to provide testimony beyond just written testimony. There are 2 times on August 23rd from 1:30 and then at 6:30. As of right now, you'll see that it is limited to 20 people.
That's what this meeting was about.
As though that is
I got another Zoom call.
limited. I'm just going to mute. There we go. So I think that there is some energies and advocacy being worked so that there can be more opportunity to do virtual because we're still in the time of health and wellness, and not everyone feels comfortable of coming out into public spaces. So I think that there's a health justice aspect to that as well. So MountainTrue and Creation Care Alliance can keep you updated if there does tend to be more opening for that on the virtual piece. And if you go to the next slide, Sarah, you can also submit a comment at this, a written comment anytime here at this location. Let me get back up to the top here. Drop that into the chat. And so there's information on this link here that I just dropped in about how to submit a comment and a resource to give that. In the chat, I saw that folks were asking about referencing an organization or a group or a company that they work with. The reason that NCIPL and Creation Care Alliance and MountainTrue are encouraging everyone to speak for themselves is because we have our own roles to play, and the way that we're submitting comments as organizations really need to be up to us. And so we want you to identify yourselves as who you are, even if you're a supporter of an organization. It's important to get confirmation that that organization, I know the gentleman that asked about the solar company, definitely confirm with your company that it's okay to reference and identify yourself as an employee of that company. I think they'll probably be thrilled, but I'm not the one to answer that question for you. I will give an example. I know that in the Triangle area, there's a group called Interfaith Creation Care of the Triangle. And what they did was, it's a collaboration of like 120 congregations in the area. And so they identified a speaker to represent their network because they're not a formal 501c3, but they wanted to have a collaborative presentation from that network. So that's an option. And another example is if you're a member of a congregation that has installed solar, for example. Again, you're going to want to go to your green team or your pastor or whoever has the authority to to sort of give permission to speak on behalf of the congregation. But installing solar is something that congregations are doing and that we're thrilled about, and that's a story that we want the commissioners to know, that we are putting our faith into action, and we need the state to mirror our commitments to care for God's creation. And so that there's your story right there. So be thinking creatively and communitively about how we can get as many voices and stories and perspectives in front of the commission in a collective way, because they are limited. I believe they were limited to, I think 50 people signed up in Durham and 36 people were able to speak. So that's not like a whole bunch of people, but the process is in play. And so the more people that attend and show that there is intense public interest around this process, and then folks that can submit written comments, we can get as many voices in front. So again, please attend if you're in the Asheville area, the hearing on July 27th. If you happen to live a little closer to Charlotte, you have an opportunity to attend the hearing on the 28th, the next day. The hearing will begin at 7. If you plan to speak, you must be present and signed up before 7 p.m. So come early. By 6:30 at the latest is what we're suggesting. And then there are pre-hearing events also being planned. And I know Sarah, with her contemplation and grounding facilitation, is going to help host with representatives of Creation Care Alliance outside the courthouse before the hearing begins. We will be meeting at 6 p.m. and additional details will be sent to this list. So I'm going to pass it back for questions.
Thanks, Susannah. And before we jump all the way into questions, I do just want to say in the chat, there was some really great additional information about how to offer testimony if you're like the example of the solar company. I think it's great to say, look, hey, I work in the solar industry. That's a part of a personal testimony to name, a part of what you do and how that's part of why you're here to give testimony. That piece about, if you're going to name your company, that's when you want to know that you are in fact, the person that your organization or company is going to put forth to give that formal testimony. But naming that you work in the solar industry, or naming that you're an engineer, or whatever it is that's a part of your personal identity, that's a great thing to add. So know that that's great, and that we encourage you to do that. And yes, we will be having a brief event before we go into the courthouse to offer testimony, if you're feeling a need just for some grounding before we go to do that good kind of citizen work. So it's now time for questions, and we've had many in the chat. One that just came up that I saw from Tahani is, can you submit a question, or I'm sorry, can you submit testimony in a written way and also testify at a hearing? Can you do both?
So I did put into the chat, we do encourage folks that speak also to submit their comments in written form. And I have an example of, one individual who I know wrote, if they were to speak their written comment, that would have taken about 6 minutes. So they condensed it into a 3-minute comment and then submitted the full written comment. So that's an example. Or you can just submit, it's always good to have sort of a double paperwork type of, because the court reporter, of course, is typing what you're saying, and you want to make sure that you get into the public comment records exactly what you said. So yeah, that's a best practice, is to submit what you said afterwards. Good question. Other questions?
I'm scouring the chat, but also feel free to retype your question if you would like to speed up that process.
I'm curious if there are folks what is the deadline for written comment? That is a good question. And because the virtual hearings are happening at the end of August, and I will search right now to see if there is like a formal deadline, but my understanding is that the end of August is going to be kind of the closing of public comment, of the public comment process. Gray, I'm not sure if you know differently, but I would encourage you to submit your comments ideally by the end of August, so that if you do provide public testimony virtually, that then again you're able to submit what you wrote at the end, by the end of that process.
There's a question, are there restrictions on who can testify? Do you have to be a US citizen? Do you have to be a resident of North Carolina?
What I put into the chat as a response to that is that if you live in North Carolina, you are welcome to provide comment. You live here. You're part of the North Carolina makeup of population. So you are the public of North Carolina. And I think Sarah had said earlier that, so as an example, many of us are electric cooperative representatives, but I actually was in a meeting yesterday with electric cooperatives and municipality utilities, and this directly impacts every person in North Carolina, because Duke Energy, as a running the utility grid for the state, in many ways, I sometimes say we all live downstream from Duke Energy. The generation side of the transmission of the grid is in Duke Energy's hands primarily. When we look at alternative systems like community solar, very, very much hope to see community solar integrated into a carbon reduction plan for North Carolina. That's an exciting example, of what is possible. So generation hopefully has the opportunity to have a just transition through this process as well. So when you're providing public comment, the most exciting part of the process from my perspective is that you can be as creative and as possible. we know what the climate emergency is. I would imagine everyone participating in this webinar today is very, very concerned about the trajectory that we are on right now with regards to the climate crisis. And this carbon plan is our opportunity to really shift how we produce energy in this state. And so when you're thinking about what it is, not just what is possible, but what is needed, that's a lot of what we're doing with the US Climate Action Network right now, is really shifting the conversation of saying, oh, but this is what's possible out here. No, this is what is needed in order to truly address the climate crisis. So excited to hear what your perspectives are and your experiences are in relationship to what you want to see for generation. And we're talking, 25, 30 plus years out. What does this world need to look like?
Great. Thank you, Susannah. I also saw a question about 2 to 3 minutes. It's a wide time limit to give testimony. I just wanted to name that we will know at the hearing the specific amount of time. It could be 2 or 3 minutes. And so that's something to consider. That's my understanding, at least, is that, 2 to 3 minutes is typical, and we will know the exact amount of time at the hearing. Is that correct, Susannah?
That's right. And I believe it was 3 minutes in Durham. And
okay, so probably 3 minutes. I also see a question from Kathy, and I know that Kathy has her hand raised about the intervening process. Kathy, do you just want additional information about what that is? You can unmute if you would like.
Thank you. No, my question is, I thought that somewhere earlier in this presentation, there was a statement that other organizations are encouraged to offer up energy reduction plans for the utility commissioners to consider. And some of those ideas, the utility commissioners may direct Duke to consider. Did I hear that correctly?
So I wouldn't say that the Utilities Commission is encouraging this, but the Utilities Commission can consider all plans in front of them, and we would encourage them to not just take Duke's proposals, but to take all of the proposals that they see. We know that there are environmental groups working statewide with technical experts. These are highly technical plans and require a certain level of expertise, but we suggest that we know that there are organizations working on submitting these, and we've actually seen one alternative plan filed already by the John Locke Foundation that encourages a ramping up of nuclear energy production and new nuclear facilities. So we know that these alternative plans are going to be coming from a lot of different perspectives, or at least a handful of different perspectives. And we want the Utilities Commission to consider them, but to also choose the best path forward for North Carolina to reach decarbonization in a way that protects multiple interests.
Okay, thank you.
I know that Steffi also has a question. Steffi, do you want to unmute and pose that question?
Oh, sure. I just was wondering about microgrids. I know that number 9 was regarding resiliency. I've heard a lot of people talk about that as an option. Just wondering if y'all will mention that as a solution.
Yeah, I think microgrids, I know just enough about them to be dangerous, but I'd say the big picture concept is that instead of having one large electrical grid, you break that up into smaller geographic areas. So if you have a failure on one part of the grid, it doesn't bleed into a larger area. And that's one strategy toward resiliency, absolutely. But I think the Utilities Commission should consider resiliency kind of from a holistic perspective and imagine all of the potential scenarios that North Carolina could face.
Yeah, and I would say that sharing about, if microgrids are a part of the solutions that you want the Utilities Commissions to consider, that still could be a part of your testimony, that's something that you are encouraging. Another thing I want to name, just because this is a hunch I have, conversations like this can be pretty overwhelming. I am not an energy expert, and I don't understand all of the jargon that we throw around in these conversations. So I want those of us that don't understand all of this to still know that the fact that, I mean, you still belong in this conversation, even if there's pieces of the energy conversation that feels over your head. We still need to raise our public voice, and we don't have to understand all of the nuts and bolts of megawatts here and there to be able to have a really, really valid and important testimony in regards to climate change and other aspects of how we have a more sustainable future here in North Carolina. So if anyone's feeling that way, I just want to name that as well. We probably have time for just a couple more questions if there are any additional questions. Tahani, do you want to unmute and ask your question? I see. And then maybe Laurent, I see you as well. Here, I'll go to you, Laurel. Yeah. Oh, you muted again. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. We'll get there. You're still muted.
There we
Here
go.
you go.
Okay. So then my question about microgrids that was just brought up, if there's a fail, just as a technical question, I guess, if there's a failure, say you've got 4 different microgrids and one of them has a failure, can the other 3 then contribute to getting the one that's failed back up again? Like, you know, instead of what's happened in Texas, because they isolate themselves and then they can't tap into the bigger grid. Does that make sense?
It makes sense to me. I don't have an answer. I don't know the answer to that question, but I think it's a valid question. And that, you know, yeah, go ahead, Michael. Do you have an answer?
I was just going to say that microgrids by definition are isolated themselves.
Okay.
And so I don't know about how you would connect one microgrid to the other, although I guess anything's possible. But I think typically the idea is that a microgrid is a small group that's all connected together, generates together, has batteries, storage together, but doesn't help one another, is my understanding.
Yeah, that's where it seems like if there was some way to do that, if it was necessary, because otherwise you end up where Texas ended up last year, you know, in a giant mess because they couldn't tap into anything else. So I guess I'm wondering if there's a way to have the microgrid most of the time, but in an emergency situation, can it be connected? I guess that's my question.
I think a lot of microgrids, and it's starting to get technical, I apologize, but I think a lot of microgrids might have a generator backup available. And so that would prevent them. I think Texas was a much bigger issue because of its grid connectivity or lack thereof to the rest of the country.
Right.
Not in a microgrid kind of way.
No, thank you for that, Michael. And I do appreciate that opportunity for a little bit of a deeper dive. I want to give Tahani a chance to ask her question as well.
Sorry, I screwed up my unmuting earlier. I was just wondering whether utilities have considered charging progressive rates, because I'm thinking of people who live in massive houses and air condition them excessively, or stores that leave doors open. Just not sure if that's talked about or not. Thank you.
I can just briefly respond to that. That often comes up in the rate case hearings, which are a very separate process. And there are multiple rate case hearings that are in the process right now. So love to talk to you more about that. For the carbon plan, it really is in looking at mitigation and generation. So there is the pricing is definitely coming up, and the cost of these forms of generation. So if you look at the difference in pricing for what Duke Energy has put in with regards to the amount of gas that they're wanting to invest in and build out, that's where the rates are going to, be impacted with regards to fuel source cost, et cetera, what it's going to cost to build out the wind and the solar. So it's affiliated, but also it'll play out in a different process.
Thank you.
Sure.
And I know that we're now at time, so I want everybody to know you're going to get a recording of this call. You'll also get some of the resources that were shared in the chat, in an email, and other information. So, we're 2 weeks out from the hearing. There's time, and you will be given additional information to prepare. And we're also here. I'll share my contact information and others.
So you can also tell people to click the button at the bottom, and they can save the chat.
You can save the chat. That's also true. There are 3 little dots in the chat If there's information there that you would like to continue to have, you can absolutely save the chat. Thank you, Laurel. Appreciate that. We hope that you all have a good day. Thank you again for your desire to take action on the carbon plan, and we will do this together to make change. Yeah, Steffi said, please remain civil and positive. Sometimes the negative atmosphere can cause issues with NCUC. That can be true, absolutely. So we want to thank them for being present and for doing their jobs, and then ask them to do them well. That's we're going to call on them to do them well, and we're going to strive to do what we can do as well. Yeah, thank you all. And thank you, Michael, for your expertise. That was great. Love it when the wisdom in the room can help this be a better experience. So thank you for bringing all of your wisdom.
Makes us all better. Thank you.
Absolutely. That's right.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Yeah, thank you all. All right.